The topic for this symposium is, can science, philosophy, and everything else model the mind? To which I hope the answer is yes. But anyway, that's my take on the topic of the symposium. One thing we're going to have to figure out is what physics means and what the mind means and what completely means and what model means and what can means, all in the space of 40 minutes, but that's the job of our panelists today. We have two physicists who are very interested in the mind, Adrian Kent and Adam Brown, as well as one philosopher who's very interested in the mind and also in physics, Paavo Pylkkänen. Can physics completely model the mind? If yes, how? If no, why not? And what extension of physics would it take?
Thank you. I'm going to take a slightly more restrictive view of the word physics than you, and my answer is yes. By which I mean not that physics alone can model a mind, but that we have all of the physics we need to model a mind, and all of the remaining tasks are for not physics, for neuroscientists, for psychologists, and for philosophers. Or at least that's got to be the default assumption in the absence of extraordinary new evidence. There are many complex phenomena in the world that we have difficulty modeling: economic systems, the weather. No indication that new physics is required to model any of those. We just need not better physics, but better economics and better meteorology. Indeed, I don't even know if new physics were required, what that would look like. What would be the form of a new physics that would help us better understand the mind? I can't even sort of envisage what some new physics we could discover would help us with. If it was a sort of corpuscle that ran around and breathed life into philosophical zombies, that wouldn't seem to be a satisfactory explanation. In fact, there seems to be no possible satisfactory explanation provided by new physics. In short, we don't need new physics. We need more neuroscience, psychology, and indeed philosophy.
Paavo?
Okay, then. So I think my answer is no. The physics cannot completely model the mind. I think we have something called psychology, cognitive science, and things like that. However, I think for modeling the mind. Now, but I think what I've been involved with a program where we are looking into whether extending quantum ontology could bring in mind, because of course we are interested in the two-way traffic between the mental and the physical. This is like assuming that we can't reduce mind to the level of physics, then we have to discuss the two-way traffic, and of course there it becomes interesting in the to see how could we describe that. And so what I've been working on is the approach of Bohm and Hiley. It's pilot wave theory. Bohm's own thinking of the pilot wave theory is much more exotic than Bohmian mechanics. So it's a bit like with Karl Marx. So Marx said he wasn't Marxist, and Bohm definitely was not Bohmian. So the way he thought about the pilot wave theory was to say that when the pilot wave is guiding the particle, it's actually informing the particle. And this has, there's a mathematical reason for that. But if we have information at the fundamental level of physics, this is more like semantic information. It's actually instructing the motion of the particle. Then whatever can control the pilot wave can control, physical stuff, including stuff in the brain. It could be in the ion channels. And so the way we've discussed extending quantum theory is to bring in maybe a higher level of this high-level pilot waves. And this way, we could actually understand the two-way traffic. But again, physics on its own wouldn't be sufficient for this, so we need to extend it.
Adrian?
So I'm pleased we have disagreement already. I want to interpret the question the same way as Adam, I think. Can the mind completely be described by current physics, including non-standard but respectable theories like de Broglie-Bohm or collapse models or string theory? And I believe the answer is evidently no, because of the phenomenon of consciousness. It's an objective fact, it seems to me at least, that we all have subjective experiences. And nothing that we currently understand in physics, no tentative ideas even in physics, allow us to derive this from those theories, let alone characterize those experiences. So I agree with Scott about the zombification argument. Everything we understand about the material world would run just fine without any consciousness anywhere. And I think, by the way, I feel a little embarrassed that David isn't on this panel because he's produced much sharper versions of these arguments than any that I can give. But I think we can sharpen that argument in various ways. It's not just the fact of consciousness, but the features of consciousness that are inexplicable by physics. We have quite a lot of it, or at least we flatter ourselves, I do, compared to most things. And we have even more of it when our well-being is at stake. If a tiger's in the room, we tend to sharpen our alertness. We can accurately report what's going on in our minds. So people often make comparisons with something like the identity of theory of heat. When I say this water is at a certain temperature, all I mean in the end is that the molecules have a certain average velocity. And people sometimes press that to saying that there's something like an identity theory of consciousness. So as Graham Mitchison used to like pointing out, if you want to press that analogy, the fact that we could report our consciousness would be analogous to something like this, that you put a microscope here and you see the individual molecules spelling out, actually I'm at 25 degrees here, it's a little uncomfortable, I'd rather not evaporate quite so quickly, if you could possibly move me somewhere a little bit cooler, I'd be very grateful, that sort of thing. We don't see that with water, but we do see it with ourselves and with each other. And then more generally, as William James long ago pointed out, evolutionarily advantageous activities tend to be consciously pleasurable, food, companionship, and so on. Evolutionarily deleterious activities tend to be painful. We could invert that completely. We could invert the pleasure-pain continuum in the phenomenon of consciousness. The material world wouldn't run just as well. We would be rather the poorer for it. But we have no explanation for current physics as to why things work out so relatively well for us. So on that view, what we have is a whole series of mysterious fine-tuning problems. We could be zombies, our consciousness doesn't have nothing to do with our evolutionary state, but we don't. And we need new theories, and unfortunately I have no idea of any detailed form as to what they should take, to try and explain those fine-tuning problems. The best we could do is, and again I agree with Scott, is to start looking at little aspects of consciousness, as IIT has, try to quantify at least some detail and see if that is quantifiable and if we can find some physical theory that might explain why those particular features at least are prevalent in the one clear examples of consciousness, our own. Thank you.
Okay, I thought I might also ask about the distinctive aspects of the mind and distinctive obstacles to, say, physics modeling the mind. I mean, the topics of this meeting are, I guess, the official aspects of the mind that we're addressing are intelligence and agency, and I heard there was a lengthy debate about whether to throw consciousness in there too, about whether the world was ready for it. And so let's throw that one. Agency, consciousness, intelligence. Which of these is the biggest obstacle, let's say, to physics or extended physics modeling the mind? And which of them, on the other hand, are relatively tractable and no problem in the long run?
In my opinion, I think consciousness is the hardest problem of those you just articulated.
That was short. Well, I think the chair of the panel has, of course, convinced some of us that consciousness is the hard problem. But I think intelligence as well. Of course, then it has to do with things like non-computability, undecidability, those kinds of depends what one thinks about these things. But well, agency too. I mean, physics really doesn't necessarily have that much to say about agents or agency yet. So again, I think we would need to extend our physics to I don't know if we take something like the Nancy Cartwright view that physics really, with physics there to solve definite problem, deal with certain definite phenomena. So I think we are nowhere near that we could discuss any of these things with physics.
Yeah, I'm not very confident about either intelligence or agency. As far as I can see, it seems possible that intelligence is a sort of umbrella term that covers a whole range of things, stuff that humans do, stuff that animals do, stuff that computers do, and it may all be explicable perfectly well from physics as we pretty much currently understand it. Agency troubles me enormously, but I struggle even to find a working definition of agency that I can fit into a discussion of what follows from physics. So the consciousness seems to be the brightest, clearest example of an absolutely compelling challenge for current physics.
And on the question of what needs to be added then to physics to get physics plus, what is this minimal x such that physics plus x can completely model the mind? Now, I guess since you said
so I said that we don't need to add anything to physics. I think, as far as the physics is concerned, the x is neuroscience or other scientific disciplines. And indeed, if you think that we're missing something in order to model consciousness, for example, I am not sure that either proposals that my fellow panelists have made are help. I don't know that some story about the de Broglie-Bohm particles are really going to help with are going to be any more of a satisfactory explanation than the existing physics already provides. And Adrian didn't even venture any physics, didn't even imagine any physics that would help, which I think maybe is, I agree with, but draw the opposite conclusion from.
I think one thing we can do here is to give some attention to our assumptions and maybe our general framework of thinking. And one idea there is, of course, is there a fundamental level? And I think it's kind of a tacit assumption often that there is a fundamental level, and that's what physics is describing. But of course, there is also the possibility that there is no fundamental level. It's there in Leibniz, it's there in Bohm in 57, it's there in Lademan and Ross. It's kind of, and you see, one thing is that if we give up the notion of fundamental level, we in a way give reality to other levels, or the other way around. If we assume that there is one fundamental level, we rob easily reality from these other levels. So let's play with the idea that there is no fundamental level. Okay, physics describes one level, but then there could be biological other levels, even psychological levels. And so what we need to add are theories to describe those other levels, which may have a certain autonomy in relation to the so-called deeper levels. And what we have to figure out is then the relationships between these different levels and also the descriptions of those levels.
I'm going to respond to Adam's implicit, very tentative challenge. I don't know in detail what we need. I fear I'm going to go to my grave not really understanding consciousness or the mind-body problem much better than I now do. But what the best ideas that the best sort of thing I think we can look for are ideas along the lines of IIT, but superior to, that characterize features of consciousness. And to explain these evolutionarily convenient features that I alluded to earlier, I think those ideas are going to have to change the dynamics of the material world. There's got to be some sort of interaction between the characterization of consciousness and the material world. It's going to have to be subtle, otherwise we'd have seen it already, but it's going to have to be effective over the course of, the history of the Earth, for example. It's a radical thought, and it's a problematic thought, but I can't see any other way to explain the fine-tunings.
I don't know if we can get a little bit of argument going here. Adam, do you want to respond?
Yes, I don't really see how that would help, honestly. That's my position. We have this mystery of consciousness. It's not totally clear to me that it actually is that much of a mystery once the neuroscientists and others have had a long go at it, and they've certainly been making a lot of progress, so we should give them some longer. But even if there does turn out to be something that would be mysterious, I just logically, I don't see how physics could help with that problem.
Do we all agree that physics, or some extension of physics, might at least be able to come up with objective correlates of all these different features of the mind? agency, intelligence, consciousness. So physics or physics plus neuroscience will give us at least very strong systematic correlates of these phenomena.
I think that's very plausible, yeah.
Yeah, and why not even constituents in the sense that if we, because the idea we've been playing around is that first of all, the wave function is describing a kind of field of information, and if there are extensions of such ontology, then those extensions, those, if you like, those higher level fields could actually constitute at least mental states, and maybe consciousness could then arise with some kind of relation. Who knows, integrated information, high order theories, global workspace, whatever theory of consciousness that in the end works. So surely, I mean, we should be looking for theory, not merely correlates of consciousness, but the interesting question is that insofar as consciousness is something that exists, can we actually figure out what is it?
Yeah, so on the assumption that consciousness is a fundamental natural phenomenon, and that there is a unified fundamental theory of physics, we should have some mapping from material states to conscious states. The other two, it's less clear to me that they need to be part of a fundamental theory. Perhaps they're intrinsically fuzzy concepts, in which case the correlations would be correspondingly fuzzy.
Paavo mentioned a two-way traffic, I believe, between the conscious and mental, perhaps, and the physical. And Adrian, I think you mentioned something about an influence on the dynamics from consciousness, if I remember correctly. And I'm kind of sorry that George Ellis isn't on the panel, as was listed. So
You have to leave.
I wanted to ask you, do you feel that the notion of downward causation he was talking about, which seems to be consistent with physics and not require new physics perhaps, could provide this two-way traffic and this influence on the dynamics that you felt was necessary?
Well, personally, I think the mental causation might well include violation of the, let's say, standard quantum mechanics. Of course, then there are problems with signal non-locality and things like that one has to deal with. But the idea is, otherwise the idea is that we have just the old idea of determinism or randomness, that the physical world is just going either deterministically or in a random way. Whereas, of course, what we want for true mental causation is that our informational states and our so-called free choices actually can make a difference, and that has to kick into the dynamics. And of course, in the pilot wave theory, whatever can kind of control the pilot wave can control physical stuff.
Yeah, I still feel I need to tease apart for myself the various different senses in which top-down causation is used by George and by others. But I think, yes, that is one way of thinking about the sort of modified dynamics in which consciousness interacts with the material world in a two-way street, in both directions. In other words, it doesn't just supervene on the material world.
So I take it that the hard problem, by definition, aims at what is left out when you've accounted for all of the relational, or if you will, all of the functional properties of consciousness, right? Now, in order to be convinced that there is something, so we need something that is, in a way, entirely non-relational. On the other hand, it can't be totally non-relational, right? Because it has to be able to affect reports of experience and whatnot in the way that some of the panel members referred to in setting out the properties of consciousness. So if there is a hard problem of consciousness, it seems to me it's very, very hard, not just physically or metaphysically, but also logically, because we have to explain how there is this non-relational relational thing that we're aiming at. On the other hand, that's so hard that it seems to require a second-order argument in the logic of relations for explaining why that non-relational relational something isn't just a contradiction or an obscure way of apprehending the incompleteness of the theory itself, but is in fact something missing, something that can be the target of a further theory. Thanks.
It would be nice, of course, to have a theory of consciousness where it was maybe something about the actual suppose we had something like a mind field, and then we could have some theory. Well, how does that field become conscious? We could have criteria for the non-conscious transitions, for example, and but then in that case, I think once you had those structures in place, it wouldn't be only about relations. You would also have like some sort of more structural features, or like in structural realism we talk about the furniture of the world and the structure of the world. So I kind of, in that sense, I'm interested in the furniture of mental states, and somehow that would also constitute conscious experience. So that in some situations, then consciousness would actually follow necessarily, and you would not be able to imagine zombie worlds. But then again, how do we work that out? Is I guess that's the hard problem. So.
Consciousness is much more fundamental than either intelligence or agency. These are obviously important attributes of consciousness, and it's important to model them in the way that we've heard about. But the problem of consciousness itself is much deeper than that. It involves a whole question of the relationship between our experience, our mental space, and our physical space. And I think to say that problem can be solved in terms of current physics, relativity theory and quantum theory, is far too optimistic. I mean, there's no reason. It's an expression of a hope, but I see no reason that hope will be fulfilled. On the other hand, we have to be aware of the fact that physics is still evolving. We know we haven't got to the final picture of physics, and I think there's every reason to think that the final picture of physics, quantum gravity or whatever it is, may indeed actually be relevant or even explain the phenomena of consciousness. I mean, obviously, people like Penrose have suggested that even quantum gravity might, in some sense, have something to do with consciousness, but one may not accept that. But I don't think it's over-optimistic to assume the final picture of physics will make some reference to consciousness. And therefore, that's a positive view, but I think it's too positive to say that current physics does it. I mean, why should we think that when our current picture of physics is incomplete, why should we think that's going to solve the most fundamental problem of experience consciousness?
I think I sort of more or less expressed agreement with your position in my opening remarks. I don't know. I can imagine future theories of physics that tell us a lot more about consciousness than the current one, which tells us nothing. Whether I'm not sure I can imagine the form of a final theory of physics that answers all the questions of consciousness, but that's probably a limitation of my imagination.
Yeah, I would sort of just briefly say that physics implies a new general framework, and it could be some. Of course, Niels Bohr thought this in terms of complementarity. David Bohm had the idea of implicate order, and I think in such a framework we may be able to find the place of consciousness in nature, like for things like the holographic principle or whichever principle you have. But again, I don't think that we're going to reduce consciousness to physics. So I don't think if physics is describing the physical world, it's difficult to see that and if physics is about little thingies, I mean, it need not be about little thingies, but if it's about those little thingies, so I don't think there's going to be very much consciousness down there, so to speak.
Would any of you suggest that the apparent mystery of consciousness might at least be mapped precisely onto some other open apparent mysteries, such as why there is something rather than nothing, or which would be, I guess, the most obvious apparent mystery that seems similar in form to why there is some consciousness as opposed to no consciousness, or perhaps the theory of why there is an arrow of time, which is actually the one that feels like most natural match to me, being sort of equivalent to why there are bits instead of no bits, or why there is causality instead of no causality.
Maybe, but I don't see it has to match onto any of those. I mean, the arrow of time that you brought up, I think a very defensible position would be that in thermal equilibrium there is no consciousness. So you might imagine that the reason there was no arrow of time is because you were in thermal equilibrium. But that's just a necessary rather than sufficient condition. You could imagine there being an arrow of time without consciousness existing.
I like the sort of Wheeler-esque idea that the universe somehow needs conscious observers to support its own existence. But I like it sort of as a Zen koan to meditate on. I've never really found a way to put it into mathematics or physics or do anything with it. But in a poetic sense, I sort of sympathize with the idea that those two questions might be connected. I just don't see any path to connecting them.
Okay, time for coffee. Thank you very much.